we want to thank Mark for a really great class. A lot of really useful information.
Oh, look, I'm getting
yeah.
Yay.
Aside from playing the violin, you taught them how to use the little clapping things. I don't even know how to do that. I don't know where I find that. Oh, the reactions. Is that what it is?
Probably.
There it is. I got it.
Yeah, I'm finding it too.
There it is. So before we end, if anybody has any questions, then, I mean, maybe if Mark has a minute or two to spare, we can allow that. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to unmute everyone. I had to change the settings around just because of that incident. I now understand why the schools were having issues with Zoom. But anyway, so I'm going to unmute everyone. And if you have a question, then feel free to jump in and go for it.
Any questions from anyone?
I have a question. Hi. Okay. So I was told that you do jazz, you play jazz, and I was wondering, how do you incorporate the violin into jazz when you're playing?
For asking that question. When I first started learning how to play jazz, it was not on violin. It was on 10 years old when I started playing saxophone, and I had a really amazing music program in the school that I went to as a child. So I was playing saxophone, and I had an incredible band teacher. We had a really great stage band, and that's how I learned how to read the chord symbols and the things you might be aware of, what they call lead sheets for many people playing jazz. That's how I learned how to Then it wasn't until I was in my teens that I decided I'd try to play it on the violin. And I'll just say this, the difference between playing jazz on saxophone and jazz on violin, and I know my saxophone friends yawn whenever they hear me say this, but saxophone is pretty easy because it's one fingering for everything. But just think of all the possible permutations and combinations on a violin. There's no such thing as one fingering for everything. There's endless possibilities. So it's a learning curve that, even though I've been doing this most of my life now, there's still ways in which I am integrating understanding left-hand technique and bow technique in my jazz playing, and that continues to develop as I get older. So I'll say this though, I do feel like, having spent so much time in the jazz world now, that when I come back to playing, for example, just supposed to be playing Schubert Fantasy a couple of weeks ago, all that got canceled because of coronavirus. I find that going back into playing classical music after I've played a lot of jazz, it's like I'm able to interpret the composer's thoughts a little bit differently, because when you're playing jazz, part of the role of you as a soloist playing jazz is to play music in the moment, to be an instant composer. So the instant composer idea, when you're learning how to play solos in music, you're learning how to interpret harmonies. You're learning how harmonies are supportive or not supportive of any melodic idea. And so when I come back to playing unaccompanied Bach or playing Schubert or playing whatever I'm playing, it's from a slightly different viewpoint, and I feel like it does enhance my understanding of what composers may have meant from the interpretive level. Does that answer your question? I love talking about that because I find many of the greatest musicians that I've ever had the great fortune to work with over the years are people who love both sides of the creative experience. They love the form, and they are enraptured listening to some of the great works of classical music, and then they love the freedom of the improvisation of it. And so, for example, at the time of Bach, a lot of composers were also great improvisers, and some composers that I'm sure you would have heard of, like Corelli or Tartini, they would write pieces that would leave an awful lot of empty space in them for you, the interpreter, to improvise in. So that's a part of the musical experience that was around until Beethoven, and then it started to basically die pretty quickly. And then it's come back in the last 50 years or so. We see a lot more people who are both composers and performers, and composers of classical and performers of improvisation. Great question. Thank you, Carolyn.
Hey, Mark, are you teaching any jazz at the university in Toronto?
I have a string improv class that I teach. I taught it when I was at McGill for several years, and now that I'm at U of T, I teach the same class there. And it basically goes from early Baroque medieval music up until present moment avant-garde. So jazz is actually only part of that class, but then there is a strong jazz program at the school, and I will inevitably be with them a few times throughout the year, even though my primary role is in the classical modern violin department. Any other questions?
I have a question. So I noticed that like you were teaching us those like weird stretching stuff on our fingers, and like you were like showing us a whole bunch of stuff to improve ourselves. What do you like to do as a warm up usually when you play?
Question. I do have a regular, and it's a combination. This first one is very, very, very strange. It's designed to get used to a sense of balance at the knuckles of the hand, because I'm sure you're aware, the way our hands are designed, the greatest power in the left hand is here, close to the thumb. So this exercise is to exercise this side of the hand to have a sense of balance, which can somehow be the same as this. So it starts. Very, very simple. And I do that depending on what day it is. I'll do it in different positions and different keys, but it's to exercise all of the different spacings between the left hand, whether it's what I just did, which is tone, semitone, tone, or you could do one that is semitone, tone, tone, or tone, tone, semitone. So it's very basic, but it's very, very important for getting a real sense and feeling of this side of the hand being equal, or as equal as possible, in flexibility and strength as what is naturally over here. Just do this for all the violinists there. Just do this little exercise for me. This is super cool. It's super easy, but it will show you the example of what I'm talking about. If you all put your left hand up as if you're going to swear allegiance to the United States. Can I see your hands up? Put your hands up. Okay. Now, with your left, this is your left hand, not the right hand. With your left hand up, put your first finger down and towards your palm. All right, just your first finger. Notice how not that easy to do that, right? Then second finger, not so easy to do that either. Third finger by itself, fourth finger by itself. Do that pattern one more time together. Let's do the first finger towards the palm, back up. Second finger towards the palm, back up. Third finger towards the palm, fourth finger. Now, as the exact opposite, try this. Put all four fingers down at once. How easy that is? See how total simple that is? When you compare the feeling of that action to this action, you get a really clear idea of how, when you move the hand into violin position, the base of the knuckles are your biggest friend. All right? Because this is where you're going to have your possible, this is where you're going to have all of your strength and all of your reactivity from the string outwards, like I was talking earlier to Christian about this. You need to have a reflex, and it's at that point at the base of the knuckles that you really develop that. So with my left hand, I'm trying, when I play the instrument, I'm trying to avoid doing this, because that gets to be so tiring so quickly. But I try my best to do as much of this as possible as I'm playing, and I do that all day long. Everyone feels that as an example? They can see that? Going on from there, after I do that, then I'll do usually a little Dunas exercise, which is a brain game more than anything else. So it's to combine a few different actions all together. So there's left hand pizzicato, and then there's lateral motion of fingers. So I'll do that as the next part of my warm up. Then after that, usually a run in thirds and then some fingered octaves. And that'll pretty much get me into a feeling of like I'm in shape to start practicing for the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Other questions from anyone?
I have a question.
Please.
So you're talking a lot about scales and double stops and how to practice them. So my question is like, how do you translate like practicing scales to like putting it into a piece, because sometimes I have like a problem with, I practice the scales, but sometimes it's hard to like keep the same technique while I'm doing the piece. Like sometimes I'll get tense.
We're having a hard time hearing you, Mark.
Yeah.
No, you sound good.
Not. Okay, is that better? You hear me now? Okay. So Miguel, it's a really great question, and it's a very valid one, because when we're practicing scales of any sort or we're practicing exercises, that's clearly not music, right? Would you agree with me? That's not music. Those are the ingredients. Think about it as if you were constructing a sentence in English from beginning to end to tell like chocolate ice cream. Those are all words, but they don't really mean anything unless you put an energy behind it and you then portray a character. Like, I really like chocolate ice cream. This is the key to understanding the answer to your question. Because when you transfer playing scales or exercises into real music, you have to take into account the shape and the attitude and the emotional standpoint of what you are saying musically. To use another example in speech, I used to take acting classes with this really wonderful teacher in Vancouver. And he would insist that I learn to speak Shakespearean text. And the reason was because I didn't understand it at all. I would read Shakespeare and I'd read it for him in my lessons with him, and he would just look at me and go, "You have no idea what you're doing." And of course, I thought, well, I'm speaking all the words correctly. What am I getting wrong? And it was him that pointed this out to me, that in my interpretation, quote unquote, of speaking Shakespeare, I didn't have any interpretation at all. I was just reading the words. And so for him, it had no real content. There was no glue between each word. So what I would have to do would be to change my emotional standpoint from which I deliver the words. So if I give you an example, there's a speech at the end of one scene in a Shakespearean play where a guy who reveals himself as being a trickster, he goes, "And as I'm an honest Puck, if we have unearned luck now to scape the serpent's tongue, we shall make amends ere long, else the Puck a liar call." Now, I just did that with all of the verve of trying to speak Shakespeare, but if I tried to say the same words without any of that emotional content, it would say, and if we escape the serpent's tongue, if we err along, else the Puck a liar call. Basically, there's the problem, right? So every time you're trying to figure out a musical phrase, you have to get inside the mind of the composer in some fashion. You use your imagination to be a time traveler. If you're playing something from 200 years ago, you play time traveler in your imagination, you go to that time and you ask yourself, what could Bach have possibly meant by this? Or what did Schubert really want by this? What did Kreisler ever really want with this? And then you decide, oh, maybe he really wants this to be joyous. Or, oh, maybe he's asking a question. Maybe he's saying something very declamatory and he needs everyone to understand it. So all of those possibilities are there, and it doesn't really matter which decision you make. As soon as you make a decision, it is going to impact how you connect those words, or in our case, notes in a play, notes on the page. If you really want to, you can actually watch. There was a piece written for me a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, but we made a video of it recently. It's for violin/narrator and brass band. And it's up on YouTube. You can find it easily on YouTube. And it's me playing fiddle with a brass band, but also reciting Shakespeare throughout. And that's why I had to do the training with that coach, was for this particular piece. And if you listen to it, of course, you know, I'm no Shakespeare genius by any stretch of the imagination. You can probably tell that I'm putting the same kind of energy into playing the phrases of the music on the violin as I'm trying to do when I speak the text of the Shakespeare. I'll send a link to the maestro here, and he can share it with you, just in case anyone wants to listen to it. But as Miguel, that is one of the biggest and most important questions anyone can ask, because you're absolutely right. Sometimes when we are trying to transfer that work we've done in technique and put it into a piece of music, where's the answer? Like, who gives us the answer? So you have to decide what position you are starting from, and then let that answer create a shape in the phrase, and then you're ready to go. Thank you for such a great question. That was good.
Now, I don't think we should take that much more of your time. You've been here for a while. But for some reason, we can't hear you when other people are here. Give me 1 second. I don't know how to fix that. But before you go, and I'll mute myself after this. A lot of these kids are eventually going to come up to do their college auditions. Some of them might go into music, some might not. I don't know. Maybe they'll minor in music. If they were to show up at U of T to audition for you, what are the things that you, or maybe you and maybe your faculty members, I don't know how you guys are doing it there, but what are the things you're looking for to bring them into your school?
So, you know, the musical world right now has been in a state of change for the last decade and a half. It used to be that we would all go to music schools, like when I was a student, and we could then put ourselves into the track of getting our excerpts ready to go do an audition for an orchestra and then get a job in the orchestra, and then that was it. But that's all changed a lot. And so a lot of people who are coming into schools for music now, at the undergraduate level, you do need to have a certain level of ability, whether it's technical or musical. They both need to be, relatively speaking, high. But we're now in a situation as educators of looking to find a way to really tap into the individual's gifts to discover for themselves what it is they want to do in music. I'll give you a couple of examples from my own past, my own students. I had a student that I taught for like 3 years. He was a good kid. I had no idea at the time I met him what he would really do. But then over the course of those few years, I began to see that he had a bit of a mischievous and entrepreneurial spirit to him. And he also wanted to try a lot of different types of music. So usually, traditionally, when you go to music school for playing classical violin, you learn your Mozart, you learn your Bach, you learn your Paganini, etc. And that's still true. But that's not the end of the exploration now. That's the beginning. So once you've learned how to play your Bach, or you have a decent appreciation for how to play Bach and Mozart and Paganini and whatever other composers, Tchaikovsky, violin concerto, all of that's still there. But after that, there's another world of exploration where you can choose different paths that are good for you. So in the case of the student I just spoke about, he started his own Baroque training institute. He started a folk music festival in California. He basically has done all these things that I think students now want to try and do. They want to do something other than one path. And so while music schools used to be just geared towards the one path, the better music schools are now saying, okay, you've got to get your X, Y, and Z figured out. And then from there, we're going to find out what your best gift is to give to that musical world out there. So from my perspective as the teacher, what I'm always wanting to do is convince the student that what they're doing when they play the instrument is a gift to the listener. If you can figure out what it is you have to offer, what you have to give, once you've figured that out, you're not going to want to do anything else, because it's going to feel so great. That giving is going to feel so great, you're going to want to do only that thing. I think you probably have an example of that with your conductor here. Clearly, he's found a path for himself. And when I knew your conductor, there was no hint that he was going to be a conductor. I didn't know that about you at all. Like, who knew, right? So, but he found that within himself, and his entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, talk to me about it. I didn't have any idea that he had this cigar business on the side. I didn't find that out till years later. Like, I didn't know any of those things about him. I knew him as a violist, and he was a good violist, and he was a decent student. People liked him. But all the other sides to what he had to offer the music world, the things that you now know about, those were surprises to me. So I think what we're looking for when you come to audition, of course you want to sound good. Of course you want to sound like you can play in tune. You need to sound like you know how to use the bow. Primarily, that's the biggest downfall of a lot of students when they come in. If the bow is very rudimentary, even if the left hand is great, there's not a lot that we can do because the bow needs to be your voice on a violin. That's really what it is. Your right hand makes you you and makes me me. So we need to see those things at point of entry, but then we want to know how much you want to give in this whole musical life. And when we tap into those things, it's not like you need to make a decision in 4 years of undergraduate, but I want to see that you have a path forward for yourself after that's over so that you can take the steps that are right for you. And then you can plant yourself in a community, just like your boss here has planted himself in Las Vegas, and he's dedicated himself to you guys. He's dedicated. Look at all your faces here. This is his life. He's dedicated himself to you. This is his musical voice. He's giving over to you, and then as you guys get older, you will then give it over to somebody else, somewhere else. Maybe it'll also be in Las Vegas. Who knows? Maybe you'll be his teaching assistant in 10 years. You never know. But that's really what you want to do. When you come into music school, it's a competitive zone for sure. But for our students at U of T, I'll just say the violin area at U of T is probably the most collegial of any big school I've ever been at. I've taught at McGill, I've taught at Stanford. I've never experienced such an easygoing, collegial bunch of violin people. Because violinists, we're usually the troubled guys, right? We're usually the ones with the biggest attitudes, the biggest egos, biggest problems, biggest headaches. But this particular team is very positive. We're very supportive of each other. We will regularly keep the door open for any student from any studio to come in and listen to our lessons. And we will, if somebody wants to have a lesson on me and something and they're from a different studio, as long as they tell the teacher and the teacher says fine, then they're welcome to come into my studio and have an extra lesson or something, and vice versa. So it's a very positive space to be in right now. More than that, know what you have to offer as best as you can right now, but work really hard to show that you can use the bow well, because that means that you've tapped into the big key of expression on the violin, which is the right arm. The left hand, it only kind of takes so much knowledge to figure out how the left hand works. And once it's done, it's done. And to be honest, we basically do what the Russians told us to do about 120 years ago. And we're still doing it now, and it works like a charm. But the moment-to-moment experience of your right hand and your right arm in conjunction with the violin is what makes you an individual. So you show us that you've got a sense about that. It doesn't need to be perfect, but if you show us that you've got a sense about that, you're on the right track. Thank you guys. What a pleasure spending time with you all. And I'm looking at some of the pictures here, and I'm looking at the sun streaming in to your windows, some of you, and thinking that I just saw snow about 3 hours ago. I am quite jealous. So thank you all for being such a great gang, and good luck to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I can hear him. I'll leave. Oh, sorry.